You're listening to the Nutrition Experts Podcast, featuring guests who take the scientific talk about food and break it down for practical use. You've heard the phrase, "You are what you eat." Come find out what that really means. Experience conversations with experts in the field of nutrition and understand the power of food for our health, well-being, and beyond. Now, here's your host, registered dietitian and nutritionist, Mathea Ford.
Hi there, it's Mathea. Welcome back to the Nutrition Experts Podcast, the podcast featuring nutrition experts who are leading the way using food. Starts today, right now, with our next guest. It's great to have Amanda Laird on the show today. Amanda, welcome to Nutrition Experts.
Thanks for having me. I'm excited.
I'm excited to have you on the show and share your expertise with my tribe because it's a little different topic than we have ever talked about. So today we are not talking about being vegetarian or gut health or how often you poop. We're going to talk about something a little more interesting. So Amanda, tell my listeners a little more about you and what you do.
Yeah, absolutely. And I will also set this up to say that actually all those things that you just mentioned do have a link to our topic today. So we can bring it back full circle. But I'm a holistic nutritionist. I specialize in hormonal and menstrual health. And I'm the author of a new book that just came out. It's called Heavy Flow, Breaking the Curse of Menstruation. And I also host the Heavy Flow podcast, which is a weekly show about periods, body literacy, and reproductive wellness.
What is the term holistic nutritionist? I think we all know nutritionist, you work with food, but how does holistic come into that?
Yeah, that's a great question. So the holistic perspective is that we're not just talking about food. We're really looking at the whole body, the whole person, body, mind, and spirit. So when I work with clients, 60% of the time we're talking about food. And then the rest of that 40% is also looking at lifestyle, exercise, spirit. And I use spirit in a very general sense. So whatever that means to you, but looking at stress and meditation and all that great stuff that can help you heal.
We're going to talk about periods, menstrual cycles. Let's talk about a little bit about what is normal and how do you know if it's broken or abnormal or whatever that would be? Can you give us a little bit of that?
What most of us learned in middle school health class, if we were even lucky to learn the basics at all, was that your menstrual cycle is 28 days. Right? That 28-day number has really been accepted as what is standard, what's normal, what we should be aiming for. But in reality, what is considered to be normal and healthy is a much bigger window. Your menstrual cycle is the first day of your period until the first day of your next period. So all the days in between, not just the days that you have your bleed. And that can fall anywhere from 21 to 35 days. So that's a 2-week window of what is considered normal. And that 28-day number is actually just the average that sits in the middle of that 21 to 35 days. So that's the length of your menstrual cycle. Your period, your actual period should really be between 3 to maybe 7 days. Depending on how long your overall menstrual cycle is, will depend on how long your actual period is. And we don't want to be seeing a lot of symptoms or a lot of side effects in the PMS window. So if you're getting a lot of pain or cramping or mood swings or very, very, very low energy, that's all a red flag that some hormones may be out of balance. And we want to be looking into that because our periods should be coming up regularly and without a lot of fanfare.
Do you recommend using any sort of apps or anything like to track your period to kind of see what your cycle is?
Yes, I love that you brought that up because even though, we do have guidelines as to what is normal and healthy, I always coach my clients. I'm always talking about on my podcast and in my book that it's most important that you know what is normal for you because there's a lot of factors that go into what is normal, right? Age, whether you've been pregnant before, lifestyle stuff all has an effect. So I absolutely recommend getting to know your cycle and tracking that however you wish. So, you could do it in your paper journal. You could use an app. I love apps like Clue are great for tracking your period. There's lots of, as periods are becoming more mainstream and cooler, there's lots of journals that I'm seeing coming out that are specifically for tracking your menstrual cycle as well. So how you do it doesn't actually really matter all that much to me, but tracking the first day of your period, any signs of ovulation that you might be seeing, like cervical mucus, or you could take your temperature every day. And then also, of course, symptoms in that PMS window, like pain, cramping, headaches, all that kind of stuff will help you come to know your menstrual cycle.
So is it typical, like a young girl, 12, 13, 14, when they start their period, does it take about a year for it to kind of even out, or does it take longer?
It would take about much longer than a year, I would say. And really, your hormones don't really balance out and regulate. And so what I mean by that is that you're actually ovulating every cycle until you're about 20, 21 years old. So it takes a long time for your body to really ramp up and to be ovulating regularly and have those hormones balance out.
Can you talk a little bit about the messages or taboo around menstruation? Because I think that's one of the things that struck me immediately was like, wow, we're going to talk about periods. I've taught my daughter I'm like, you should not be ashamed that you have a period. And my husband does not do this with any sort of malice, but he'll act like it's like, oh, don't talk about that. And I'm like, it's normal. That's how children come to be, that's how we have that. So can you talk about some of those common thoughts and messages that women have about menstruation, and then maybe help us to identify those things so we don't feel shame about it?
We definitely have been taught that periods are something to be ashamed of, that they're gross, that we're dirty while we're menstruating. It's something that we are supposed to keep secret. I can think of a dozen or more times in my life when I was, slipping a tampon into the sleeve of my sweater, or like trying to keep it secret while you're going to the bathroom, right? And these are messages that have been, passed down from generation to generation in lots of different ways. But in, the 20th century and, of course, modern day age, we see this a lot coming up in marketing, right? The marketing messages that we see on television or in print ads and magazines, or even online, the overarching message is that your period is something that has to be managed. It's something that's supposed to keep secret. The worst thing that could ever happen is a leak or a stain or somebody finding out that you are on your period, right? And how convenient that these large companies that are manufacturing menstrual products have the solution that will keep your period under wraps, right? They make pads that come with crinkle-free wrappers, so nobody's going to hear that that's what you're up to in the bathroom stall. And they come with odor protection so that the smell is covered up. And, when you're using products that are like tampons, it's even keeping it hidden away, right? You never have to see or interact with your period at all if you're using tampons with an applicator. You don't even have to touch your own body to insert a tampon with an applicator, right? And so they're really reinforcing these cultural norms that we have come to accept, right? The reality is, menstruation is just a bodily function. There's no shame in that. As you said yourself, we're all here because our mothers had periods, right? And it should be treated as such. And in fact, our menstrual cycles are a sign of good health, right? If we're menstruating regularly without a lot of side effects, that's an indication that our body is healthy, right? The hormones that are implicated in our menstrual cycles, like estrogen and progesterone, these are essential hormones to our bodily functions, right? And they help promote good health. So progesterone is key in promoting our brain health, breast health, bone health, heart health, right? We should be thankful that we have menstrual cycles because they're keeping us healthy.
That is something I hadn't thought about, the whole marketing messages, but you're right, exactly. That's kind of the underlying tone there, is that it's something to kind of be ashamed of. So yeah, I've strongly talked to my daughter and said, don't be ashamed that you have a period. It's a girl's, that just happens, and it doesn't mean it's not a bad thing, but it is something that you kind of have to push into the brain, because like you mentioned, the health class stuff in the US anyway, I know you're in Canada, but in the US, boys and girls are put into different rooms. They watch the films, they talk about it, and then it's kind of hush hush, and they come out of the room and nobody talks about it,
Absolutely. And I should also say that a lot of these programs, these, puberty education programs or sex ed programs, are actually sponsored by the big companies that are making menstrual products, right? When I was researching my book, I looked at some of the materials that these big companies are making available to schools at no charge, of course, for them to administer puberty education. And I found it very interesting that some of the things that was covered in the little pamphlets and booklets that are being distributed is, they're talking about, okay, how do you manage your period? They're talking about, removing body hair. They're talking about managing vaginal discharge, which is something that really gets my engine going, because vaginal discharge is a normal, healthy thing that isn't even discharge. It's just your cervical fluid, right? It's an indication of fertility and health, yet they're selling the solution to this. They talk about, body odor. And what are the products that these companies sell? They sell pads and tampons and panty liners, and they sell razors and shaving cream, and they sell deodorant and douches and these products that are designed, and not to say that we don't need health. Like we do need to, be keeping ourselves clean for healthy reasons, but it's just very interesting that these messages that young people are getting when they're learning about puberty for the first time are really centered around the solutions that you can buy, right? Like at the end of the day, who cares about body odor? It's not actually a problem generally, but we have constructed it as something that is gross and something that we're supposed to be ashamed of. And isn't it convenient that we have these products that we can buy to cover that up, right? It's the same messages that we're getting around menstruation too, and body hair and countless things.
Thinking about your period, and you may have some problems, is there ways to make your period easier using nutrition or other things, or limit the negative effects, like you mentioned with some PMS or cramping, that type of thing?
So going back to what's normal, I should say that, a little bit of fatigue, some light cramping kind of falls into the normal category, right? As our hormones fluctuate, they have an influence on our energy levels, they influence our appetites, our sex drive. So there's a lot of influence that hormones have on our body. So it's normal that as we get closer to our period, or when we're on our period, we might be a little, less energy, more fatigue. Our body's working hard to menstruate, right? We're losing a lot of nutrients through the blood. Really, the threshold, though, is your period interrupting your daily life. Do you feel like you have to call in sick to work? Are you canceling plans? Are you staying home from school? Are you, staying close to home because the pain is so severe, or because, you're having to change your pad every hour, and so you feel like you can't leave the house, right? That's really the threshold that we want to be looking at. And I think that starting with food, I'm a holistic nutritionist, so of course I believe in the power of food. That was a leading question there. And starting with some simple changes to our diet and also to stress, how we approach and manage our stress levels can have a significant effect on our menstrual experience. I'll share a few tips in a second, with the caveat, though, that it's not a silver bullet. And so if you have made some changes to your diet and you've given it a couple of cycles and things aren't getting better, that's really a red flag that something else is going on that should be looked at by a doctor. Maybe something like endometriosis or fibroids or PCOS, and that kind of warrants further investigation through medical treatment. So what can we do? Unfortunately, I don't think that I have any real surprising news for what we should be eating to make our hormones a little bit more balanced and our periods better. But, really focusing on whole, unprocessed, healthy food. So all those things that we know are really good for us, right? Fresh fruits and veggies, leafy greens, whole grains, complex carbohydrates, and really focusing the majority of our meals and snacks and what we're eating on those whole foods, and eating less of the processed, packaged, high sodium, high sugar foods that we know don't make us feel great, right? A few things in particular that I think are really great are leafy greens. I literally feel like you cannot eat too much of them. And so my one and only food rule, and even so I break it all the time in my own life, is, take a look at what you're eating. Is there something green? Can you add something green, right? And that's going to help to crowd out some of those less nutritious foods. And also making sure that we're getting a lot of fiber. So eating the complex carbs like the starchy vegetables, sweet potatoes, squashes, whole grains, nuts and seeds, right? Flax seeds, sesame seeds, pumpkin seeds, all these things are really fantastic for hormonal balance. And then to talk about some specific nutrients, especially for pain, if you're getting a lot of headaches or you're getting a lot of pain and cramping, magnesium is so great. It works as a muscle relaxer and can even sometimes give you instant relief. And so I like taking magnesium as a supplement. You can get a powdered supplement and make a little tea for yourself, which is nice to drink. And zinc is another one that is great for painful periods. And also fish oil. Fish oil, if you don't want if you are looking for a vegetarian source, then things like evening primrose oil, flax oil, depending on where you are in your cycle, can be really helpful for that too. So yeah, eating well. That's the short answer.
So are there certain, I always think, are you going to be low in iron? Is there any sort of B vitamins that you need to supplement with? Is there any of that sort of stuff that you need to supplement with to help keep your energy, make you feel better during your period?
I am always a little bit weary of just making a blanket recommendation for any type of supplements. And so I would recommend, anybody who's listening, you first want to start with getting blood work and getting your levels checked, because, iron is important, right? And so if you are especially if you have heavy periods or very long periods, or even if you have very short cycles, and so your periods are coming close together and your body's not having the opportunity to kind of recover your blood stores, you are at risk for low iron and of course anemia. But you never want to supplement with iron until you know for sure that you have low iron. Eating iron-rich foods, cooking with an cast iron pan is great way to keep that up too. So definitely get your levels checked. And then I also love a B vitamin. If I was going to recommend a supplement across the board, I think almost all of us are deficient in B vitamins. If stress is an issue, B5 is really great for helping to support our stress. And B6 is great for estrogen imbalance. So if we are seeing some of the symptoms of high estrogen, unopposed by progesterone, which is stuff like long cycles, heavy periods, painful periods, a B6 can be helpful for that. But I always recommend get your blood levels checked first and, speak to a naturopathic doctor or somebody who is an expert in supplements before you take anything, because there's a lot of ifs, ands, or buts with supplements.
Yeah, I love that you mentioned magnesium as a relief. I use magnesium to prevent my migraines. So my doctor suggested that a long time ago that I take magnesium, and it really does seem to help lower the number of migraines that I get, so to speak. So.
Yeah, absolutely. And actually, when we're talking about periods, we often talk a lot about like cramps. But even more than cramps, more people get like menstrual headaches, right? Or hormonal headaches. And magnesium is great for that too.
So back to kind of, thinking about the messages that women are getting now, that young girls are getting now, that from their parents, from the TV, from school. What is the message that we should be giving women about their period? If you had to, kind of distill it down to what is it that women should know about their period?
The one thing I think anybody listening to this or passing information on to, a young person in their life who might be meeting menstruation for the first time would be that your menstrual cycle is a vital sign, right? It's an important physiological function that's not just for making babies. We have this idea, thanks to, hormonal birth control, which is amazing. It's great that we can choose when and if we want to conceive a child, but it has also given us this false idea that our reproductive system is just something that we can turn on and off, which I think is a pretty short-sighted attitude to have, right? You're 17 years old, you have irregular painful periods, take hormonal birth control until you want to get pregnant when you're 30, then you can come off it. Which, some people have no problems with that, but we are seeing, a lot of people being challenged with the return of their menstrual cycles after long-term hormonal contraception use. So I'm getting off track here, but that's all to say that we need those hormones. Those hormones are good for us. They're important. They're not just for making babies, like I said earlier. So embrace it. Learn to embrace your cycle. And if it's painful, if it's irregular, if it's interrupting your life, that's not normal and it warrants medical attention.
I was telling my daughter the other day that from now on, for the rest of her life, until she goes into menopause, that every doctor's appointment, they're going to ask you, when was the first day of your last period? Your doctor even considers it a vital sign, because if you do have some interruptions or issues. But how do we change, that message? How we talk to people about it? What do we say differently?
Well, that's just the thing, is that we don't talk about it, right? Maybe you would talk about it with a daughter or a sister or a very close friend of yours. But if you have menstrual cramps that are so bad that you're calling in sick to work, are you calling in sick to work because you have menstrual cramps? Or are you saying that you ate some bad sushi last night and you think you have food poisoning, right? So I think that, opening up that conversation to actually, talk about our experience and pushing back and saying that, this isn't right. And if we're seeing a medical professional that you see them and you have very painful periods or something's not right with your period and they just kind of shrug and say that, oh, well, that's what periods are, I think that we should not be accepting that as an answer. And, my vision for a menstrutopia, right, is that we can talk about our periods like we talk about any other bodily function, right? Oh, I'm feeling a little luteal today. I feel a little off center. I'm going to get my period soon, just don't feel that great, right? Like, why can't we say that when we go meet a friend for lunch, right? If I showed up and I had a runny nose and felt like I was getting a cold or a flu, I would tell them that. So why is our period any different? I do like to kind of put a caveat around this conversation too, that, I've talked a lot about periods being kept secret. If you feel like your menstrual cycle or your period is something that you want to keep private, I totally respect that. And I don't think we need to be, talking about our periods all the time everywhere. And if you're not comfortable talking about your period, then I respect that. But keeping something private and feeling like something has to be kept secret and you're ashamed of it is a different thing. And if you are feeling like you're really just not comfortable talking about your period, I would really challenge you to also think about, where did that message come from? Because it's likely that it's a marketing message that was designed to keep you ashamed and designed to make you feel like you have to buy products.
It's also really valuable what you mentioned a little bit about knowing what your personal period time is, because then you can stand up and say, to your doctor, if they're like, oh, you really shouldn't be having a period of 35 days, you can say, for the last 5 years, my period's been every 35 days, so that's normal. So then when it comes to fertility, how is that affected with your knowing kind of what your period is and when you're ready to become pregnant?
Mm-hmm. Well, the wonderful thing about our period is that it can actually never be late, right? So we think about, oh, your period is late, and that's not true, because our period will always show up right on time, which is about 2 weeks after ovulation, right? So there can be some variation in our cycle length. So it's not uncommon for somebody to have a 30-day cycle, a 28-day cycle, a 32-day cycle. But that's not your period that's moving around. It's ovulation. And that first half of our cycle leading up to ovulation, which we call our follicular phase, is very, very sensitive to stuff like stress, illness, travel, sleep, right? If your body doesn't feel like, this is a safe, optimal time for ovulation, it's not going to do it. So you might feel like, if you feel like your period is late, I always recommend thinking back 2 weeks ago, right? What was going on 2 weeks ago that would have made your period late? And oftentimes people are like, oh, that was the weekend we moved, or, that I had a huge deadline at work, or I was traveling. And it's like, right. So there's your answer. Your ovulation was delayed. And so now your period hasn't shown up. So that 2-week window, right? And certainly if we have some issue, like, it's possible for that window to be shorter if there are issues around progesterone or hormonal imbalance, but it'll never be longer than about 14 days because we just don't make progesterone that long unless we have become pregnant. So learning your cycle, and then learning to identify what your signs of fertility are, because that vaginal discharge that we have been taught is gross and dirty is actually liquid gold, right? It is telling us that we are fertile, right? And that we are coming into our fertile phase. And I think it comes as a shock to anybody who's tried to get pregnant that you actually can't get pregnant any time of day, any time of your cycle. And the window for when you actually can achieve pregnancy is quite small. It's really about 5 or 6 days around that ovulation time. So getting to know your cervical fluid, which changes throughout your menstrual cycle. So sometimes it's, thick and creamy and it looks like hand lotion. Other times it's stretchy and clear and it looks like egg whites. That's when it's very fertile. That's the good stuff. or, sometimes it can be very watery. So I really recommend a book to anybody who's listening. It's called Taking Charge of Your Fertility. It is 2.5 inches thick. It is the Bible on fertility awareness. Will teach you everything you need to know about cervical mucus. So really learning to interpret that. You can also, get to know your cervix. It's actually not that far away, just about a finger's length. Getting to know your cervix, where it is, because it moves around in our vaginal canal. So when we're closer to ovulation, it's up high in the vaginal canal, and it's open and it's soft, feels kind of like the inside of your cheek, right? And when we're not around in that fertile window, it's much lower in the vaginal canal, and it's harder and feels more like the tip of your nose. And it's also very tightly closed, so nothing is going to pass through it, right? And so getting to know your cervix. And then you can also take a daily basal body temperature reading, which can help you identify where you are in your cycle. And while ovulation can only be confirmed by ultrasound, it's the only way to know for sure that you have ovulated. When we do ovulate, we can oftentimes see a slight shift in temperature. And so if we're tracking our temperature every day, we're tracking our signs of fertility, like the cervical mucus and positioning, then we can also take our temperature and maybe see when we may have ovulated. That can happen on day 7. It can happen on day 21. I have polycystic ovarian syndrome, which means that my cycles are long and they are irregular. However, I was still able to get to know my body, do some things like eating well, taking supplements, working with a naturopath to take herbs and homeopathic medicine to help promote ovulation. And I was able to achieve pregnancy when I wanted to, even though my cycles were 45 days long, because I knew when I was ovulating, right? And so I knew when the optimal time for conceiving was, and I was able to achieve pregnancy. Meanwhile, my doctor took one look at me, said, you have PCOS, you have irregular cycles. I think before you even try conceiving, let's sign you up for the fertility clinic. I think when you know yourself, it can be easier. That's not to say that simply tracking your cycle is going to solve every fertility issue. But, if you feel like ovulation is day 14, I had this conversation with a client. She was really struggling with conceiving, and she was having sex on day 14 because that's what she had learned, is that you ovulate on day 14. Her cycle was 22 days. So day 14, that window is closed, my friend, right? It is, she was ovulating day 7 or day 8. That's the reason why she wasn't conceiving, because she simply wasn't having sex on the right day, right? Sometimes it is oftentimes it's more complex, but sometimes timing intercourse is really that simple.
Okay, so thinking about everything we've talked about related to this topic, how can the information be used by the listeners in their day-to-day life?
I love this concept of body literacy, which was a term that was coined by a woman named Laura Weschler. And she's a, sexual and reproductive health educator and advocate. And what body literacy means is that you are able to read and interpret the signs and signals that your body is giving you. Understanding the cervical mucus, understanding the shifts in your hormones, and just getting to know your menstrual cycle and getting to know how different phases of your menstrual cycle might make you feel different ways, right? We live in this society that really values sameness, right? And feeling the same every single day. And we're supposed to be bright and cheery and ready to go to work every single day. When in reality, especially for female bodies, right? That's not always the case, because As I said earlier, when we're menstruating, our energy levels might be lower. We might be a little bit more fatigued. And then after our period is done, we reach that window, which I always like to call the Beyonce phase, and our estrogen is rising. And studies have shown that in that phase, we tend to be chattier. We tend to be more ambitious. We tend to be more willing to take risks. We want to be out in the world experiencing life, right? And then after we ovulate, those energy levels tend to drop down a little bit more. We might want to stay closer to home. We will be craving higher calorie, higher fat foods, right? Because our body is smart. If we ovulate and we did happen to conceive, right, your body is going into that safe protective mode, right? You're craving that higher calorie, higher fat foods because if you are pregnant, you need to sustain yourself and a pregnancy, right? So if you feel like you can't stop eating, butter or avocados or, these fatty foods in the second half of your cycle, it's not that you're weak and you have no willpower. It's your body is trying to protect you and doing the best thing. So if we can start to understand how our hormones affect our day-to-day life, and we start to understand that we do live in a cycling body. And so we're going to go through periods where we feel more energetic, periods when we feel less energetic, get to know that and start to cultivate compassion and kindness and self-care routines that are going to help us. I think we'll just be happier, healthier individuals as a whole, because then I'm going to be in my PMS window, going to be getting closer to my period. Generally, I find I'm a little bit lower energy. I turn inward, feel a little more introverted during that time. That's not the weekend to plan your best friend's bachelorette, right? Wait for that Beyonce phase, right? Wait for that Beyonce phase and you'll have a much better time, right? You're not canceling plans all the time.
I always ask my guests, what is your favorite food? Since we usually talk a lot about food. So what's your favorite food, Amanda?
This is so cliche for somebody who talks about periods as much as I do, but I really love chocolate. I would eat chocolate more if I could. If it wouldn't make me feel sick, I would eat chocolate 7 times a day. I love it. I love it. Yes.
Any particular chocolate?
As a nutritionist, I'm supposed to like, high quality, dark chocolate, but I want a Cadbury's Dairy Milk bar. That's my favorite.
I can't say I blame you. Those are pretty good. Yeah. All right. Well, Amanda, thank you so much for being on the podcast today. It was a pleasure to have you on the show. I know my listeners learned a lot about menstrual cycles and just kind of the messages we as women tell to ourselves and hear in the media. So if listeners want to contact you or connect with you, what's the best way to do that?
Yes, please. They can go to my website, which is Amanda Laird.ca. So that's Amanda Laird from Canada. Keep that in your mind because it's .ca. And I'm also on Instagram at Amanda Laird. And my book, Heavy Flow, Breaking the Curse of Menstruation, is available wherever books are sold.
Great. Well, guys, this has been another great episode of the Nutrition Experts Podcast, the podcast that is all about learning more so you can do more with nutrition in your life.
You've just listened to an episode of the Nutrition Experts Podcast. Be sure to get more information about this week's episode at www.nutritionexpertspodcast.com. Tune in next time for another great conversation with a nutrition expert and expand your personal knowledge in the field of nutrition, one conversation at a time.